Hi, I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And this is Will and Luke Discuss,
a vodcast
and podcast
where we discuss content related to psychology,
personal growth,
self-development,
and well-being. This episode, we're discussing
The Search for the Secure Base by Jeremy Holmes. So this is a book that was on my reading list when I did a master's degree in psychotherapy. And Will, you and I covered a book on attachment in romance, and that was more a book for the general reader, whereas this is a more academic book, and I thought this would help us dive into attachment theory in more depth, not just in romance, but in how it shapes our sense of self and the people we come to be.
It was a really great recommendation. I know it was a book kind of on a secondary list that you had that's kind of related to kind of your work, and thought it'd be helpful for me as well, given our career choice and that sort of thing. But I thought it was a really great book. It's very dense. There's a lot of really good information in actually quite a short book. So I think we were talking before this around kind of our general note taking and kind of key highlights of what popped up in the book. It was actually quite hard to narrow down exactly what stood out for us, because there's so much. So I think our general approach we're going to go forward today is just kind of give a bit of our understanding around, kind of attachment theory, where it comes from, how it influences us in day-to-day life, and then how that impacts our sense of self, and also some other key interests around, kind of narrative and the story of self, and how we can use narrative in order to create change and kind of outgrow some old patterns, and particularly with people that we work with, but also this is helpful for anybody listening, and including ourselves. So
I'd like to jump in with, I guess, what the book is, and perhaps why Jeremy Holmes chose to write this.
Sure.
So as you point out, it's nice and short. So John Bowlby, who sort of formulated attachment theory, he wrote like a trilogy of books on his work, and I've dipped in and out of them, but very briefly. But yeah, they're big. So part of what I think Jeremy Holmes is doing here is really reducing the size of all that content for a reader to consume much quicker. Also, attachment theory isn't, unlike psychoanalysis or CBT, it's not a psychotherapy. It's just a scientific theory, descriptive theory. So it's not a practical theory. So also what Jeremy Holmes is doing is he's trying to pull elements out of psychotherapy and relate it to attachment, to make attachment a more give it a more clinical angle, rather than just a descriptive angle of how we come to bond with caregivers growing up, and how that shapes the way we see ourselves in the world. And I think in doing that, he makes he tells a story of how one might come to be who they are, and how they might learn to change that if they want to.
And he's also kind of he does look at some kind of common practices in psychotherapy around change and narrative, and applying an attachment lens to it as well. So it's kind of coming at it from different angles, which is really useful. And it does seem kind of quite central actually to our relationships, to our sense of self, to how we become who we are. And it's kind of, I suppose, relatively common knowledge amongst, in the field, that kind of like there is an impact of childhood into your adult behaviors. So it certainly does feel very important. I think he does a really good job of kind of like bringing it in and using some very useful analogies as well.
So let's cover a bit about attachment theory then, for how do we understand it? So I'll give it a crack, and you fill any gaps in. So attachment theory.
Yeah, this is right at the cusp of my knowledge. So it's pushing me too much. Yeah,
it's a theory. So John Bowlby, like I said, was a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst. But he wanted to bring a more scientific lens to all these sort of Freudian concepts that are fairly unfalsifiable. And he thought in doing so, he would bring ethology into humanity. So ethology is watching animals in their natural habitat, right, and learning that way rather than studying them in the lab. And he kind of brought that lens into looking at infants and children as they grow up with their caregivers. So prior to that, like Freud and everyone else in their clinical practice would be kind of guessing about people's childhoods based on the stories they're telling as adults. Whereas Bowlby's like, well, we can actually study this, right? We can look at what happens to children rather than guessing. And so he built a few theories around how children develop and how it kind of shapes who they are and who they become. And the first real solid evidence he got for this was from, I think it was a PhD student of his, Mary Ainsworth, who conducted this strange situation experiment. And that's where you take a child and their primary caregiver, for the sake of argument, I'll just say mother, into a strange room. Strange meaning that the child's never been there before. There's a group of toys on the floor. There's a stranger sat in the corner of the room, and the kids with mum. Most kids would sort of play with the toys briefly, and then part of the experiment is mum leaves the room for 3 minutes, and then you just kind of watch how the child reacts and how the child responds when mum comes back in the room. So then that's where we come up with these 4 attachment styles originally, right? So which we called secure, ambivalent, avoidant, and disorganized. So the secure kid would like play with the toys, mum would leave the room, the kid would get upset, mum comes back in the room, the kid gets a cuddle, shows mum it's upset, gets easily kind of soothed, and then will continue to play with the toys. So it's like, can play with the toys, can explore, gets pissed off and upset when mom leaves, but then is soothed and then can continue. Someone with an ambivalent style would be upset like the secure person, the secure infant, but when mum came back in, they would be struggled to soothe back down. So they perhaps wouldn't go back to the toys. They'll either stay fighting and upset with mum or just cling to her and not be able to explore and play. It's almost like I don't trust that that you're going to stay if I go off and play, so I just need to stick with you.
Yeah.
On the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got this avoidance style where the kid like doesn't even batter an eyelid when mom leaves the room, and will just continue to play with the toys and perhaps doesn't particularly acknowledge her when she comes back in. So initially they thought, well, maybe these kids are fine, but when they added like measuring anxiety through various physiological measures, heart rate and stuff, they found that actually they internally were just as anxious as any other kid when mum left, but they just found a way not to express it. So those are the main 3. Yeah.
And I suppose just to build on the secure style, so I guess a child who has a secure attachment style would be what he's describing as psychological security, which is entirely dependent on the caregiver. So basically what he's saying is like in infancy, if our caregivers have given us consistency, reliability, responsiveness, non-possessive warmth, and firm boundaries, there can be a internalized secure base which offers this psychological immunity to the child. So with those in place, they can see themselves as safe when the mother has left the room. But on the flip side of that, if care is what it describes as suboptimal, there'll be these whether they're protest behaviors or repressed behaviors, kind of that you've outlined in avoidant and ambivalent styles as well. That they'll repress, they'll project, they'll split off, they'll suppress their vulnerability in exchange for like more external security.
Yeah, so they're all strategies for getting as much contact and attachment and safety as possible, and that depends on how their caregivers generally respond. So if their caregivers, like you point out there, can be responsive and nurturing and consistent with that, then the child can just trust that when I'm upset, I can come to you, I can get calmed and soothed down, and then I can go off and play, knowing that you'll be there if I get upset again. That's the key point, right? And then, whereas if the caregiver is primarily not in tune, they might meet their other needs, they might feed them and provide them toys and stuff, but if they're fundamentally not, he had a really nice phrase, something about seeing them as a, having an inner life basically, but seeing them as conscious beings with an internal existence, and being able to tune into that. If that's missing, then the child will never have their inner life reflected back at them, and those needs won't be met. It needs to be seen, need to be attuned to, so they push it down. But if that's kind of met some of the time, then it's like, I know I can get it if I try hard enough, but I'm going to have to cling to you and keep screaming to get it, because I feel like, if I go off and play, you might disappear. So there's a lack of trust in that ambivalent style.
I think you pick up on a really interesting point. I think maybe the term you look for was like that mirroring process that the mother and the child can have around, like, that can enhance a child's sense of self and create that internal secure base. That if their pain is responded to as like kind of like, that appears to be pain, and it's responded to in a nurturing way, then they can kind of relate that feeling as their own and know that it's can be nurtured internally as well. So like, I suppose something I've written down here is, the avoidant, if it's an avoidant child, they have a split off sense of self that's unavailable for comfort. So there's obviously, if that's the process of them growing up, that they eventually realize that actually it's better just to kind of like separate myself from sense of self, because no one's going to comfort me anyway. I might as well not be here. Then with the ambivalent child, there's like a deficient sense of self, so they're often clinging to the mother. I think that's what you were saying, kind of when the mother comes back in the room, that the child would be kind of clinging to the mum for a sense of safety, without having their own internal secure base to kind of return back to, because that hasn't been mirrored back to them. Right. As part of the process.
I'm just going to pick up on something there. So the process of it. So at this stage in this strange situation experiment, I think the kids are something like 9 to 18 months old. Yes. So at the moment, we're talking about an external secure base, right? It's patterns of assumptions of where their actual parent is going to be. But then over time, that starts slowly to become internalized. So it's now no longer like, where's, let's take it to adulthood. If you've had that secure attachment, it's now no longer, where's my mum, when you're 25, but it's like, if I'm distressed, do I have a kind of inner sense that I'll be all right. I'll get through this. I'll be able to soothe myself and reach out for help if I need it, soothe myself if I can, like if, other people aren't around. So at this age, we're talking about an external secure base being like a physical person, but then over time, that becomes a sense of like identity we hold within us.
He talks as well a bit later on in the book about how like we like around age 5, our kind of our voice becomes internal, like we stop kind of shouting out just what pops up in our mind, externally, but it actually becomes internal as well. I think something maybe worth touching on is what he talks about as like the 6 domains of attachment theory. Might kind of help kind of wrap up these concepts. So I think we've spoken a bit about the concept of a secure base. And he's saying that can be like representative of a secure base, not just physical as well. So a secure base is it's like a sense of home you can return to when distressed, and a platform from which you can explore the world from. So as an infant, that's an actual person, usually mum, and then as you grow a bit older, it might become dad, grandparents, siblings. But as an adult, you have an internal secure base, hopefully, which you can then explore yourself and the world from. So as a secure base is the concept, but it can grow from being a physical, real object in the world to being an abstract sense or feeling in our minds and bodies. And I think you've touched on number 2, which was exploration and play, which is like key to a secure base capacity. So like the ability to kind of step out in the world, knowing that you've got a secure base to return back to, that closeness can be restored once you've kind of left those secure relationships.
So a secure base is key to be able to play and explore, and that's how we learn essentially. So really important to know that if you feel safe, right, you can learn, you can play. But if you're like, I don't know if I'll be safe if I go off and explore, then you're just going to have to cling, and then you miss out on all that learning experience.
Yeah, kind of stuck in survival mode almost, as opposed to learning mode. The other one was protest, assertiveness, and anger, and I think that one's kind of around that our protests will be heard, and that we can protest against something, and it will be responded to in kind of a fair way. So it's that you're and also that you're able to kind of express your wants and needs, and that you can kind of repair relationships based on that you've been able to express yourself and your preferences. This is later in life, without fear of that relationship ending. And it's excuse me. So with the avoidant attachment style in this strange situation, they don't protest, right? Mum's gone and the child is internally anxious. She comes back and they don't protest. And so they assume that's because generally for that child, that's made things worse. If I show any sort of neediness or anger, not only has it not helped meet my needs, but it's actually created more distance. Perhaps I've been completely ignored or shut away in a room, or my parents got angry at me back. So it's like, well, don't show your protest behavior, hide your anger. And if you're just pretend like everything's all right, at least they're still hovering around and things are stable and okay. So and I guess like further to add to that is kind of being able to respond to loss as well. I think that definitely ties into what you were saying, that you kind of what he says, like, but Bowlby says that coping with loss is key to psychological maturity. So if we haven't learned how to cope with whether it's a caregiver or someone kind of leaving us or endings very well through our early childhood, it's going to become more difficult in adulthood if that's not been modeled to us as well.
So we might protest at a separation, but a loss is like a permanent separation, right? And so grieving is the natural process of loss, and if we aren't allowed to grieve, or we haven't got any space or any mirroring to grieve, and we keep that in, then that's going to cause all sorts of problems later. Depression, probably.
I wonder, I guess is trying to just summarize a bit about what we're talking about, whether you could just talk a little bit about internal working models and kind of the reflection function as well. I wonder if that's something worth touching on. So these are the last 2 of the 6, are they, that you started this? So when I was talking a moment ago about how we have a secure base, which, you know, as an infant or any mammal for that matter, as a small mammal, your secure base is mum, essentially. And then I talked about how for us humans that can become internalized. So we, you know, as an adult, we don't cry to mum in the same way we did when we were 2. But so what's happened in between? Well, what's happened is we've built an internal working model, as Bowlby called it, of ourselves and the world. And it's like a map, a framework, a schema, a template of how the world works and how we're responded to and who we are. And we build this map out of our experience, right? So we have all these experience of expressing needs, how that's responded to, and all the implicit messages we get through that. We create a map, and then that's the template from which we make all our assumptions and predictions going forward. So if I don't know, if a parent was abusive, for example, you kind of have 2 choices as a kid. Either they're evil and wrong and want to do me harm, in which case I have no secure base, I'm dependent and helpless in the home of someone who's bad,
or I'm bad and I deserve it, in which case I can live in safety because my parent can be good, I can live in safety, but I'm just a bad person. And we almost always plump for that second one, right? So that's an example of what might be part of your internal working model of yourself, is that I'm bad. And then all these assumptions like don't express myself, don't be angry. Like if someone wants to take something from me, you should submit and let them have it, kind of thing. So
putting your needs second, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Conversely, we might have the opposite kind of working model if we had our needs attuned to and met.
And with like reflexive function, he says that like the capacity to talk coherently about oneself, life history, relationships, and relational distress. So, like saying that's a really key component of be able to kind of understand your attachment style, and I guess how that affects you is being able to like talk openly about the things that have happened to you and be able to. There's a story that makes sense about how that's contributed to your life, and kind of like a general level of awareness and ability to construct a narrative about what's happened to you, and make sense of like quite observable behaviors in your life, like make those unconscious things quite explicit, is my understanding.
So that's it's probably a really good point here to put in the second major experiment in attachment theory. So the first one was that strange situation with children, and the second one is something called the adult attachment interview, which, as you might guess, is with adults. So in this, you interview an adult for about an hour, asking them all questions that are going to trigger their attachment system. So questions about their caregivers growing up, their parents, their family, their home life as they were children, any questions about being hurt and what they did when they were hurt, questions about loss, describing their caregivers' characters, that sort of thing. All these questions that trigger the attachment system. And in this experiment, you're not really listening to the content of their answers, but you're listening for the way in the style with which they answer the question. And then they end up being able to categorize them and relate the way in which we talk about ourselves and our lives with the same categories as how infants respond to mum in this strange situation experiment. So with, as you just pointed out here, with a secure attachment style, you might be able to construct a narrative about your life. So tell a story about these questions that are being asked to you. You know, what was your mum like when you were a kid? You might be able to give a sort of coherent story that flows and that is kind of not too little information, but not too much, that makes sense to the listener, as if I'm holding your mind in mind when I'm telling you the story. It's got emotion in it, but it's also got logic to it. So it makes sense, but it's not just void of emotion. And that's the sort of, secure narrative. And that's, to do that, we need this reflexive function, which is, the point of what you just raised. So someone with a dismissive style might be just giving really short answers. How was your home life growing up? Fine. What were your parents like? Yeah, perfect. Great. There's just no content. It's just very short, shut down, small answers. Whereas the ambivalent style might go off. All the emotion might be in there, but there's no coherence. There's no logic to the stories. They're jumping around. You're like, I don't know what your point is, but you've been talking for 20 minutes now. That's that kind of thing. And so what we're, in therapy at least, he's suggesting what we're trying to do with these two styles is help them bring that that reflexive function in, so that they can tolerate emotion at the same time as bringing logic into the story. And somehow that creates this internal sense of security that hasn't been there up till now.
And can support with like remodeling the story as well. Like if you're able to kind of understand it in its entirety with the emotions attached to it, you're kind of in a better position to, like, you understand it on a broader level. Thus you're able to kind of remodel your story and maybe kind of introduce more helpful behaviors if the previous ones have been destructive.
Right. So with that example I raised of being abused and just like having to decide as a child that, well, I'm bad, then now that you're an adult and you have your independence, if you're able to bring that emotion and that story back to life as an adult, you can see, well, obviously I wasn't bad. Like I was a helpless infant born into a dangerous situation. And you can even take that as far as, and what was it about my parent that led them to do this? Well, actually, you know, they grew up in this war and they were probably abused in this way. And you can start to paint a much more logical, coherent picture of how things happen that aren't just like so personal, and how, you know, in that example, I'm bad or something like that.
I guess like tying it a bit to the book in terms of, you know, his angle on it, he's saying that like through like challenging somebody's narrative and providing them a safe, secure base in which to explore those feelings, you can like re-narrativize your story and your life if you're kind of challenged gently in a way that isn't going to kind of cause the person to shut down or protest. Is sort of like a safe space to explore those feelings and emotions and the associated behaviors.
Yeah, good point. So that becomes the point of therapy, is that the therapist themselves and the space you create together is the secure base that you need to explore yourself, your life, your narrative, your story, your feelings. Wow.
And can therefore contribute to an internal secure base, the search for the secure base.
Great. I feel like that's I know I spoke a lot through that, but I feel like I've got all the background stuff I need to out on the table to feel that we can just riff on this now. Good.
I think it's important, like looking at the time, that was kind of roughly what we had in mind. We're going to take maybe I suppose a third of this to explain what we're actually talking about. So I suppose I guess in terms of maybe just jumping to things that interest us the most, I'll kind of just jump to one of the chapters I found quite interesting around attachment and narrative in psychotherapy. So in terms of like that as a tool to kind of go deeper into the individual story. You know, so I guess just some of the things I've put down here, you know, like the work of psychotherapy is to find stories that correspond with experience. So like by disrupting cliched stories in avoidant attachment as one thing. So as you were saying, like avoidant people can have quite cliched, over extensive stories that kind of don't, so I'm getting that the wrong way around. Like with avoidant people, they can have quite short, sharp, blunt answers that are kind of a bit cliched, where like with narrative, you can kind of expand that and open it up a little bit. Whereas with ambivalent, they can have too wider reaching stories. Yeah. So
it's like with the avoidant or dismissive. Okay. I've just realized I should say in the adult attachment interview, they gave the same styles different names than they did in this strange situation. So when I say avoidant or dismissive, I mean the same thing. Or if I say ambivalent or preoccupied, they're also the same thing. It's going to get confusing for anyone who's brand new to attachment theory. But go on.
I think that the main, I'm kind of like riffing off a couple quotes here, but like what he says, you know, the main quest as a worker is to look for a more elaborated, all-embracing, spontaneous, individualized, flexible story that encompasses a greater range of experience. I think that really captures it nicely, and how story can really influence that, because often we can argue a point with logic, and that kind of gives us there's like a degree of certainty we have with that, but with stories and like through art and music and creation, kind of like the flow of life, we can create stories that like we understand on like a physiological gut, like intense level that makes sense to us. And I think what story allows us to do is to kind of like unpack that. And I think another key part of this is what he's saying is it's around the ability to story break and then story make. So it's a lot around kind of like deconstruction of like previous stories and then constructing new ones. And I think that's like quite deeply a creative process that can be supportive through like whether it's psychotherapy or just a general narrative approach. I think that's the bit that like really exciting. Exactly. You know, some of the some of the approaches, through journaling, being able to kind of like write as if you were somebody else, or different angles of looking at yourself, or the person you're working with. It's a really interesting thing. And also, like, a part of that is giving someone the maybe not giving, but supporting someone to kind of have the, what he describes like the aggression to break your stories down, like giving someone the motivation, the drive to be like, this is not who I am anymore, and supporting someone to create new stories that are kind of in a way that can contain the emotion that goes with what you're feeling. It's really fascinating. I think this is the chapter that really got me. Yeah.
That's that same anger or protest that we repressed, that we talked about earlier, right? It's like, why would we learn to repress our anger? Well, if it gets us less attachment, if it means we're more rejected, more ignored, then we might. But it's that same anger, that same protest we need, as you point out, to sort of break these cliched stories up and allow the emotion to come through them. So at the moment, so for the avoidant style, not remembering much of your experience, not really being in tune with your sensations and emotions, means you come out with stories that are either short or only logical and objective, and there's no,
they lack details. They're like poorly fleshed out. There's no
and there's no inner life in there. So it might be like, I went to the shops and I picked up some lettuce and then I came home, but like, what was going on in you? What thoughts and feelings were you having in this process? That's what makes a story. Whereas the ambivalent or preoccupied style would have all the emotion, but there'd be none of the objective stuff, none of the logic. So it's just hard to comprehend. It's like, and I was overwhelmed, and then I was thinking this, and that reminded me of that time when this happened. But then I felt, it's like, whoa, like pause a second, and so you were here, and then you're feeling this way, and you thought this, and then you went here, and it's like, the objective for either swing of this attachment style is the same, to help ourselves and others construct narratives about their life that have both the objective and their inner life, the subjective, in the mix together. But the avoidant has kind of split off from all the inner life, the subjective, and the ambivalence just too overwhelmed to bring the sort of logical, coherent narrative to their inner life, because they've not got that internalized, secure base to contain it.
Yes, I think this is like a really key concept of the book that's super interesting. I think he talks about like how language itself, words, has structure. Like there's kind of structure to that, but then the meaning we give to that is what creates like a narrative, and that's kind of our sense of self. There is like a storied self, he says, like a sense of like who we are, where we came from, where we're going, the things that have contributed to our life. And like without that ability to construct a secure, coherent narrative, we're at risk of being like, misunderstood or lost. And the people we work with, they're often trying to piece together parts of their life and try and make sense of them in a coherent way, and that's a way in which we can support them. I like what he says about raw experience plus meaning equals narrative. So it's kind of what you're saying, like really tapping into those kind of raw emotions of the situation and being able to kind of give them the structure that words and sentences and like logic gives us, but not kind of going too far either way.
Because language is a way of symbolizing life and experience, right? So it's like, rather than this uncontained mess that doesn't make sense that's going on within me, if I can put words to it or just symbolize it in some way, even if it's a drawing, if I can symbolize it in some way that then I can eat, and especially if I need an external secure base, which I can then show to you, and you can show me back that you've understood my inner life and perhaps even help me move on and explore it further, then it brings that sense of like my experience is containable. It's not overwhelming. A baby is just so overwhelmed with their experience that they're just helpless. They need an external sense of security. Whereas by building this, what he calls a reflexive function or a capacity to bring narrative to your experience. It's incredible, really, that can help us feel okay in ourselves, in our skin. It can help us make sense of who we are, where we've come from.
What he's saying we're aiming for, in terms of like what a secure narrative would be, that was someone who's kind of able to distinguish between their own experience and that of others, and someone who's able to represent their feelings in a coherent way, and have the, what it says here is like, have the capacity to break up stories and reform them so they are more in keeping with the flux of experience. So they're a lot more kind of grounded in the changing nature of reality. Like they're able to update their stories and not hold them so tightly that they kind of can get stuck in old patterns as well. So it's not such a case of like having one story that stays forever. It's a matter of having, as I think that's what like reflexive means, as opposed to like reflective, like reflexive, right. That you can, it's kind of movable and adaptable and flows and can change. That can deal with losses and deal with the breakdown of reality as you see it. Because you might have a story that you hold quite tightly, but then when reality contradicts that could kind of, for some people, just totally like shatter them because they're either too close to the feelings of the story or they're too close to the logic of the story, and they can't let go of that. Whereas like having a balance between the two allows you to kind of be movable with an ever-changing world and fluctuating emotions and relationships.
Yeah. So for example, with the dismissive type, their story might be something like, I'm fine and strong on my own. I don't need anybody. I can explore, and I almost, there can be on this side of things a narcissistic streak, like I'm kind of superior in some way, and then it's a threat to challenge that story that kind of holds them so strong. Exactly. So if they can set up life such that story can not be challenged, then that's fine, right? But as soon as they get close to someone and then start to feel a need to have them, and that suddenly that their inner life is dependent on what someone else does or says, it's like that's challenging the narrative, and the drive will be get out. Like, can't cope with this, like be alone again, like stay, and whether that's actually alone as in ending relationships or just sort of cutting down emotion from the interaction, so there's no intimacy, so we can maintain a relationship at a more logical level rather than an intimate level.
And he uses like Freudian technology. Sorry, my headphones just fallen out. Use a Freudian term of identification, that we kind of we accommodate things and assimilate them as we grow. So we kind of we can almost learn to embrace those new stories as our own, where they might initially have been quite confronting. Like there's something that we can kind of adopt and kind of become part of who we are. I think another interesting part of this is, I can't remember the exact term he used, but I think it was like, we do kind of have these natural stories that we carry with us kind of anyway, kind of outside of attachment, but just in terms of like culture, lifestyle, life experience, there are things we carry through with us kind of as part of our psychological continuity moving through time. Like we are, whether it's kind of like demographically or where we live or just certain life experiences, there are certain things that we kind of know to be true that we carry with us through life. He kind of talks about them as like nodes of experience. So it's kind of not all, I think he's basically just acknowledging that it's not all shiftable. Sometimes there are things that are quite deeply ingrained in us that might stick.
Yeah, well, as what the there's a difference between changing a story and having the capacity to do that. So this reflexive function is sort of the capacity to process your experience in a coherent narrative where you both have the subject and the object. But yeah, it doesn't mean that secure people wouldn't necessarily get stuck or hold beliefs that weren't serving them. It would just mean that when it came time to process it, that function would be there such that they would be more able to quickly and more likely to in the moment as it happens, because they weren't either overwhelmed by emotion or by distance in the first place. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
What there was a part of this book that you thought was particularly interesting. I'm kind of around the construction of self, because I know we'd spoke in kind of our first ever podcast. We did attachment, and it's and how it is in regards to relationships. I think I'd just be interested to kind of hear just maybe a little expanded version of what we spoke about earlier around your interest.
Oh, I'm going to try and do this sort of in real time, so how you can help me construct this narrative. So I guess what I see is attachment being so much talked about in terms of relationships, and rightly so, because that's what it's all about. But I think in that we can miss or not shine enough light on how attachment theory helps explain our sense of self, our sense of who we are. And so so we're an infant with this mess of inner life that's just all overwhelm and emotion, and it's uncontained, and we have no internal working models or inner maps yet. And we put it out there in the world, right? No baby can lie or deceive yet. They just put their inner life into the world and see what comes back. And over time, all this stuff is mirrored back one way or another. And then we build this internal working model, but it's also part of that model is who we are. We're getting a mirror back, and that mirror tells us who we are, and that's our self-concept. And it's almost like that becomes an object in and of itself. So I've got my raw experience, and then I've got my self-concept, which is almost like my idea of me is like a person. It's like I've got an idea of Will, and I've got an idea of other people in my life, and I've got an idea of Luke, and it's almost like I have a relationship with my own idea of myself. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because that relationship is probably like we take it everywhere. Like, yes, you might have problems with, I don't know, a spouse or your mom or whatever, but our relationship with ourselves goes with us wherever we go. So it's almost like any mental health difficulty or challenge or struggle in life is going to have something to do with your relationship with yourself in that moment. And so I guess what I'm saying to sum some of that up is that to me seems perhaps even more important than the way our attachment plays out in romantic relationships, which is, affects us in ebbs and waves throughout our life as we get into different relationships. But the sense of attachment we have with our self-concept is, for me, I feel like that should be central to, well, it is central to every experience we have. We bring ourselves with us, right?
I'm thinking a bit about how, it seems like it's as much a personal journey as it is one that's kind of in relationship with other people. That kind of sense of that idea of kind of loss of ego and kind of regaining yourself through that method. Like the Jungian quote of like, we first have to like find ourselves before we can lose it.
Okay.
In sense of like kind of being able to find our own secure base before we can then kind of explore and create new and updated versions of ourselves, as opposed to focusing on kind of just how this affects us in relation to other people. I'm not sure I've got much more to add on that. I think there's certainly a lot like I'm kind of musing around that, but it's certainly there's definitely a big focus on like how attachment affects us in relationships, and like it can often be explored with that in mind. Like, how can I be more secure for my partner, or how can I be less anxious for the person I'm with, or I'm avoidant, so therefore I push everybody away. Whereas like that's actually probably quite an internal journey. There's certain parts of yourself that you push away, like the repressed self. Like we deny aspects of ourself in order to feel safe, although that does have impacts on other people. Maybe it's more of a solo journey to embark on for people.
Well, yeah, another way of putting this is when we looked at Nathaniel Branden's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, we looked at how much self-esteem touches everything. Like your sense of worth carries with you in everything you do. And this is
your ability
exactly
to make
what
choice. What
shapes it in the first place, right? And if the more insecure we are, the more that that becomes a sort of rigid staple. And you could live the rest of your life with either you're dismissive and you've denied intimacy from your life, or you're preoccupied and you've denied yourself exploration and finding out who you are. And it's like so this capacity, as you were pointing out, to allow the bits of yourself that have either you've denied because you've split off because they're too threatening to let back in, or you've denied because you've never had the chance to explore and play and learn that way. Like either way, like it's so sad to think of being stuck in that for so many years. And I don't know, this book gives a real sense of hope for how, given the right space and environment, this stuff can be, you can start off from where you left off with your first attachment figures. And if you're dismissive or avoidant, you can learn to allow feelings back in and to become intimate. And it's going to be a scary process, but it's going to add more meaning to your life. And equally, if you're ambivalent or preoccupied, you can learn to shape and find yourself in such a secure place. It's, for example, in therapy, where you can learn to feel safe enough to explore who you actually are. So you don't feel the need to be so dependent on whether your attachment figures text you back today or whatever.
I'm thinking about, kind of the wide impacts of this, in terms of, trusting oneself to make decisions, if you're kind of like allowing feeling to come back in, or providing structure to your inner narrative. It's not just in relationships, but it's actually kind of for choices you make yourself. So in terms of, thinking about, 12 rules for life, like treat yourself as someone worthy of taking care of, like actually being able to develop that intimacy and closeness with yourself, that you're able to kind of forgive yourself for your mistakes, treat yourself like you're actually worth looking after, like prioritizing yourself and seeing yourself as having value, putting yourself kind of first when appropriate, not putting others' needs before yours all the time, not being self-sacrificing. There's a whole wide-ranging impact that a strong, secure sense of self allows you, like that sense of exploration. Like, do you go for new jobs? Do you try and extend your career, or are you worried about what other people think about you or their opinions of you? Or like, how do you view your body? How do you like treat yourself? What do you eat? How do you like nurture yourself, like in regards to your health and obviously relationships, but also like your career and your like the way you treat family and the way you like allow yourself to enjoy things, because you're kind of free of maybe like guilt, opinions, shame. Like you've kind of relinquished those stories because you're able to kind of know you can return back to this secure, forgiving, compassionate base that will kind of always be there for you every time you step out into the world. And
as adults, as you've just highlighted nicely there, that we need to find that in ourselves. It's not external anymore. We like, or at least it shouldn't be in healthy development, like to have a that sense of, I don't know, we've used lots of jargon today, but if I could really hone in these just two points, it's these two needs, for one for intimacy, but the other for authenticity. And so, the avoidant people have sacrificed intimacy, and ambivalent people have sacrificed authenticity. And as you're saying, that might lead you not to pursue things you want, not to take risks, because you don't have a sense of inner safety that you'll be okay, and you're so concerned about other people's opinions or rejection that you don't allow yourself to be authentic. Or conversely, you're so concerned about being enmeshed with people that you can explore the world just fine, but you don't find intimacy. And it's not as black or white as that. We all can have mixtures of these patterns, but I find it sad when knowing that some people will never experience one half of these needs, and it's possible to do so.
I think that there's a part he talks about at the kind of in one of the end chapters. I does think kind of summarizes what you've just said there, and I think you articulate that really, really well. It's going to stick with me for sure. But there's it's kind of saying, like, in regards to kind of loss and change and things, moving on and growth and that sort of thing. It says when we can tolerate aloneness, conversely, we have achieved a sense of autonomy. We can allow ourselves to get close without fear of engulfment or being destroyed by the other. So like that is particularly for like an avoidant person, like allowing themselves to kind of get closer to those intimate needs that they have without kind of worrying about the wider impacts on themselves. And something I kind of wanted to touch on, I guess, before we start wrapping up, as in that chapter he unpacked the ode by, I've forgotten who it's by. What's it?
Wordsworth?
Yeah, Williams Wordsworth. And he says it kind of goes through the journey of kind of loss and rediscovery. And I'm sure I'm not kind of going to be saying this as well as he said it, but he talks a lot about I'll read a little bit of it here that stood out to me. It says the habitual, this new perspective encompassing and accepting loss goes beyond it to something deeper. The object can be reassured in its turn that will be well, forebode not any severing of our loves. The habitual sway of everyday nature can be enjoyed unambiguously, no longer passionately adored perhaps, but also not hated for reminding the poet of how things were and how they can no longer be. The poet has come through. He has won his palms race in which the only way is to lose and to know that one has lost. I think for me, that really symbolizes kind of the being able to kind of support people or ourselves to kind of get to that secure base that we know that like loss is growth, and it's kind of safe to feel those things, and it's safe to explore that, and that we can't avoid that. Like if we cling too closely to those narratives, we're kind of closing off from real meaningful change. And if we cling too close to other people as a external source of validation or security, we're not allowing ourselves the opportunity to kind of explore that independently. We kind of become too overly reliant on other people, and we aren't able to experience that loss ourselves and grow and learn from it and know that it was ours to lose and ours to grow from,
Yeah. Well, there's a paradox in that ambivalent side of things where, like you say that, because if we've not, the ambivalent style, lots of the distress displayed by the ambivalent style isn't their actual authentic distress, but distress in trying to keep the attachment figure there. So in what you just described then, it's like, do I feel safe enough that I have your attention, that I can be with my own grief whilst you're there, but without having to be so preoccupied with what you're thinking about me, or if you're going to leave, or if I've not got your attention. So he talks in the book in working with therapeutically with that as like, you almost have to give, when people have an ambivalent relationships with themselves and with you, and if you're trying to help them, you almost have to give them more to start with, like have them feel so assured that you will be there, that they feel safe enough to explore themselves. And in this case, or if we're talking about loss, to be with their own grief without having to be preoccupied with where you are or where your attention is.
So I kind of didn't know what direction we'd go with this one, because it's kind of a how to integrate attachment in psychotherapy, and kind of we both kind of approaching this from the angle as a psychotherapist and social worker who some of these this information might be useful for me, but we've certainly kind of looking at it in quite a unique way. It feels like we've got a little bit philosophical, which I quite enjoyed. I think we've it's certainly a book that has a lot of depth to it beyond kind of a strategy and technique and theory. It's certainly got some really underlying themes of kind of hope and support, which I liked in particular.
It says something to the self-help movement, I think, which I don't know if he says this explicitly, but he's kind of like, what we want for psychological health is to build an internalized secure base, right?
Yeah.
But he's kind of saying we can't really achieve that on our own. And so if you've not experienced it before, if you've not had that mirroring, then you'll, again, I'm not necessarily staking that I fully believe this. I don't know what people are capable of, but he seems to be suggesting that you're going to have to do that with another human being to get to that point. If like it takes, as the organisms that we are, like you're going to need your experience to be, and you're going to need to find trust in another human being. You're going to need your experience to be seen by them and reflected back at you to be able to build the secure base. And it kind of says, I'm not, obviously you can do lots of stuff in terms of personal growth on your own, but that internalization of a secure base, it gives both hope and it closes down an avenue that like perhaps maybe it can happen through a partner or a really good friend or in therapy, but it might not be something you can do on your own.
Well, what he says is that like change is around, like how change happens is around like containment. So getting a secure base. So kind of what you're saying is that he thinks that can't be done alone necessarily. Insight, which is like reflexive function, which is like role of therapists can support people to do that. But then again, like some people might have natural strengths in that, or with other people around them to talk to. And then new experience, so that kind of emotional rupture and repair that he talks about is like crucial to kind of developing like interpersonal functioning and developing self-esteem. So he says it's not about like just bringing the unconscious to the conscious, but accepting the disowned parts of self. And I think he is insinuating, I guess it's a book for psychotherapists and like social workers and stuff. So be saying that it kind of goes beyond awareness. It's not just kind of around like introducing, like intellectualizing what's going on. Like it can't just be kind of explained to you. It's something you need to have like insight. There needs to be like some development of self-awareness that is kind of done through therapy, is what he's implying.
Yeah, it's not just a cerebral process. It's you have to get in touch with your actual sensations and emotions and be able to put words to them, not just sort of guess intellectually, I think I'm this way because this happened to me, and not being feeling touch with it, literally in touch with it.
He talks about kind of being like a transference interpretation that kind of happens during therapy for people, is that they kind of adopt and assimilate those new meanings that are kind of developed through that. And I think we're saying there's emergent meanings that come from more dynamic therapies as opposed to more structured ones. So if you're kind of comparing it to like CBT potentially where you're kind of acknowledging like how your thoughts affect your emotions that lead to your behaviors, like it's quite like a structured formulaic way of doing things, but whereas more with like this dynamic narrative storied self-incorporating approach, like you're able to kind of develop new meanings that can like transfer into your story, into your sense of self that you're kind of talking about. So I think in terms of the approach, he's very much talking about like he's advocating for maybe less structured, intellectualized approaches and more kind of insightful. And I think he hesitated to use this word, but like corrective experience sort of approaches where people can kind of experience a change and what it feels like to have a new understanding of the situation.
Yeah. Well, it's that balance between chaos and order, isn't it? You have to have some structure to feel contained and safe, So there needs to be some sort of rules, like we know how long the sessions are, for example, if we're talking about psychotherapy, and we kind of know why we're here and what we're doing and what I can expect from you in terms of your attention and reflection and things. But yeah, for CBT could be an example where there's too much order such that it cages you in and doesn't allow that self-exploration. But yeah, I think a good CBT therapist definitely with people with an ambivalent style can really help put narrative to their experience, and they might not understand if they've not been trained in attachment. They might not understand from this angle that that's what they're doing, that they're being a secure base, helping this client put narrative to their experience, explore other alternatives. How would you see things differently? What other alternatives to this situation are there? It's helping really construct a narrative. But yeah, that's my way of saying I agree.
I guess it's just food for thought. It's like what sort of approach do people we work with need? Do some people need more order? Do some people need more more acknowledgement of raw experience within a contained environment? Certainly kind of inspirational for getting me thinking about kind of my approach to work, and also just in regards to kind of extending it on top of all the other things we've spoken about. I guess it just kind of adds a new lens, and particularly in regards to like the narrative and the story itself. I think that's probably my key takeaways from today. Yeah,
it's certainly cool. If I think about personally, it's certainly because I'm have an ongoing therapist I see, and it certainly has me think a bit more like, I think I have a tendency to want to make sure I'm working on specific goals, that I'm making the most out of things. And I think that can aim towards too much order. And actually, when I read this book, it's kind of like reminding me that almost he has a whole section about aimlessness, right? On one level, you don't have an aim because in the process of growth, whatever comes up in the moment comes up in the moment. You can't really plan for that. So yeah, it helps me let go a bit of that in my own personal therapy, so that I can just be with what is, rather than being too married to, I want to work on this specific goal in this way. Yeah.
I think things can emerge from that, like new understandings and new concepts, if you can't just like allow yourself just to be and to speak, and not kind of already have like a pre-constructed framework in which you're going in with. Wish to work on yourself. Right. Any sort of final reflections or things we haven't spoken about that you wanted to talk about at all? Or
I think there's 2 points you raised which I wanted to reflect on. One was about this, you mentioned Jordan Peterson's idea of like taking care of yourself and that nurturing yourself. And it just reminded me of Tara Brach's self-acceptance book we read, and how I guess the point that to have nurturing feelings at all, you have to be allowed access to them. And if you've never had that reflected back at you, it's going to be so hard to find that bit of you that can treat you with that tenderness. And I think, it reminded me of Tara Brach's book, because I guess that approach is perhaps you can do some of this on your own with a mindful enough approach. And as you listen to your own, get to know your own body through mindfulness and self-acceptance, that's a way of allowing these split off parts of ourselves to emerge. So yeah, that was in my mind.
and the second point you had in your mind? Or was
They
that
were the
linked to
same
first?
point. Yeah. I was thinking Jordan Peterson,
Yeah.
Tara Brach, but no, they're
Tara Brach,
one and the same thing.
Yeah.
That it's the finding self-acceptance. Yeah. But in order to do that, you have to allow for these split off and disowned parts to emerge.
And in regards to kind of the ongoing question, I think we pose, around like the striving versus acceptance side of things. I think it's kind of accepting, having an awareness of those parts of ourselves that we can kind of abandon for the sake of kind of achieving goals or striving to get things a certain way. And I think maybe just from like an attachment perspective, thinking about kind of what from what place are we doing that? Like we can strive from a place of like understanding and acceptance, what could be described as a secure base.
Yeah.
As opposed to, for some people, from kind of like an anxious need to please other people or an avoidant need to like run away from certain parts of ourselves. So like striving to be like the best at work because we want to avoid our relationships, or we can't accept failure, so we pick doing easy things for ourselves.
I need to maintain the narrative I'm good enough. And that. So it's the difference between if we're doing it from an internalized secure base, then it's just play, right? It's just play and growth. But if we're doing
loss is kind of part of the process as well. Yeah.
And but if we're doing it from I'm only worthy if I strive and I'm good enough by achieving these goals, like that's the only way I can feel I can maintain this story about myself. Then that really does tie into that narrative we've been kind of holding all year, really.
Awesome. I think it's really nice to kind of finish off with ways that ties into other books we've done. I'm going to make sure we do that in the next podcast. All right. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's probably time. But next week we'll be covering Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order: 12 More Rules for Life. So I think we can agree we both really enjoyed his first one, and we consume a fair bit of his content. So looking forward to this next one and see what new lessons emerge from it. I think it's going to there's always very thought provoking in and hopefully many different kinds of ways.
Fun and explorative rather than striving to be good enough. That's the attitude I'm going to take with this next one.
See if we can carry that with us. Awesome. Cool. Well, really great to talk to you, man. I think that was certainly a very dense book full of lots of information. So I'm happy with the way we kind of focused on the bits we enjoyed and kind of dissected it appropriately without going into too much detail, I guess.
I think we got the gist of it across. I'm happy with that. I feel more in touch with it than when we started. So if nothing else, that's great. Yeah.
Lovely stuff. And enjoy the England game.
I will do, mate.
So be watching
Excited. See you later, mate.